Hello and welcome to the last practical lesson. We are approaching the end of our training. We hope you have enjoyed our journey and got a solid dose of knowledge and inspiration. Today we are going to do this kind of free-flowing lesson again, but more on the casual side. If by casual we mean something really epic, because this will be VDB objects.
Don't worry though, we won't go too deep into theory. We are not going to describe all the parameters. We just want to play around with the effects a bit and start cooking with our machine in the process. We will show you a production-ready workflow so you can use these effects in your work. We will execute the scenario you are watching on the screen right now. And you can tell that it's something different than the commercial day shot. In just a moment, you will know exactly how to do all this step by step. We will teach you a few tricks to make working with clouds a little more friendly. There's no need to wait, let's get started. In this lesson, we want to focus primarily on volumetric effects, so we have already set up a few things in the scene. We can start interactive and see what it looks like. We are going to do a very quick breakdown before we step into VDB objects. We have basically the same thing we did at the very beginning in the night scenario. We have used HDRI map as atmospheric lighting, which you can already see. If I go into Material Editor, I've got the PG Skies 2124 plugged in. It is not included in this training, but either of PG Skies or 3D Collective night ones will work. We have a Corona color correct and change the exposure and gamma a bit. And we have also set the global volume material to 14,000 centimeters, directionality to 0.6. There is nothing innovative here. We can see that there is something going on in the interior, just to have something a bit more dramatic. We don't have a uniformly lit interior this time though. Remember, we usually avoid something so contrasting in commercial renderings, whereas here, the outline of the interior should be just perfect. I think it will suit us better in the narrative. Yes, we've got a lit fireplace and we've got a little bit of light projected somewhere on the elements of the interior to boost that glow just a little bit, to cast some shadows. Just 3 or 4 corona spheres grouped together fairly in one area. We can see the intensity of these lights here. The sphere in the room is smaller, the color temperature is very low everywhere. The spheres in the fireplace are smaller but also very warm with high intensity. And this gives us more or less that effect. That would be it for interior light. One more thing is that we still have a person in the composition. This is a character inserted from Anima 4D. And introducing a character here, maybe it's a bit cheesy, but we are not trying to do any great art here. We want to learn something, and I think this person will work with the interior and establish a fairly cool center of the composition. We have given him a yellow coat here to contrast with the blue surroundings. It should play quite nicely. And what we can see now is a water scene that is quite dark. So far this tone mapping is completely default and could actually stay that way. We would just introduce a curve here and just do the small correction. Above all, we want to raise the mid-range here, so that the image gets some additional detail here in these blacks. As for the whites themselves, we tone them down a bit. Something like that, more or less. We will be adding more lights later on, so we don't have to worry about it being too dark. It seems quite alright so far. We can also add some vignette here. Whenever we have water and the sky, it's basically such a no-brainer to darken those elements a bit. So I can do that even in the frame buffer. I'm no worried about overdoing it. Most likely we will bump it up later in Photoshop as well. So in terms of tone mapping, we have basically got that set up. We won't be changing anything else specifically. Maybe possibly an exposure correction later on as we move forward. Okay, at this stage, we would like to tackle the relighting. We've got a dark scene here, and now we want to introduce some artificial unrelating lighting here. Well, let's start by saying that I would like to add such a fairly solid corona sphere here. Somewhere here on the right-hand side. We can see how strongly it casts light already, of course, and we need to adjust all this. We will definitely reduce the intensity. We can increase the size a little bit. Basically, this sphere can be visible everywhere we want. And if we talk about temperature, we don't want a warm light, but rather something cold. Saturation somewhere in the middle. The blue color should match more or less the atmospheric light. Now we'll adjust the position. And maybe the height itself. I'd like it to be higher, a bit above the buildings. Let's see how it looks when we turn the light up a bit. It seems that the direction itself is cool. We are emphasizing that facade, it creates this impression of moonlight at that color temperature. The intensity is way too strong, since we are going to add some additional directional lights in just a moment. Maybe we should stop at 20 for now and come back to this later if necessary. Next, we'd like to elevate this area behind the building. In fact, we did this 2 lessons ago. We reduced the size of it. We want to draw out the silhouette of the building here. So we are going to hide it behind this object of ours, and the volumetric fog should do a nice job here. Okay, now I think we can move on to the directional lights, with which we will illuminate both our building and our silhouette. We want to introduce this kind of soft but directional illumination, which could be read as illumination just from somewhere in the sky, or from the moon, or from something on this right side related to this kind of very naturalistic atmospheric lighting. We will use corona discs for this purpose. We want to turn on the target. And first we are going to illuminate our building here. Maybe we'll make it a little smaller. We are aiming at the center of this facade. Let's see what it looks like in the side view. In terms of directionality, well, let's start at 1 to see where the light falls. It's actually falling right into where we want it to shine, so okay, let's reduce it now and see what it looks like. Okay, I think that's more or less the direction we are looking for. Maybe we would just move it a little bit so we don't have that reflection in that glass. Okay, that's better now. Perhaps the reflection is too high. Let's see how it looks with all the options turned off. I think the building looks better off now, so let's do a little trick here. We could copy this light and set reflection on. With a weaker intensity so that we don't have these strong blips of light. We can control it 100% with this. I mean, we have one light that affects this illumination and the second light that affects just these highlights. We can notice how this glow works with global volumetric. This invokes the feeling of haze, which should fit this scenario really nicely. We are really very happy to welcome it. It also helps to introduce depth and to create a coherent feel for the whole scene. We would also like to introduce one more directional light here. So copy any of the ones we've had so far and direct them to our character. We'll only use it to illuminate our character. This light can also be relatively stronger. And in order not to flood the whole scene with this light, we'll use the include-exclude option and just include our character. And at this point, this light only affects the lighting of this character, the reflection in this wet coat. So we can increase the intensity at will. We don't increase the lighting of the whole scene anymore. Okay, so that's how we have this element brought forward. Maybe I can adjust these two lights a bit more. I will try to go left and right, and maybe I will tone down this highlight on the glass. Maybe I will even raise it a bit. I notice that the highlight suddenly appears in the metal surface, and it's even more annoying than the reflection in the glass. Let me ignore this reflection, it's not so bad after all. We can always remove it somehow in post-production if it gets too big, so I'm going back with that light more or less in that area. That highlight, by the way, might be from that sphere. It's hard to say. Never mind, I'm pretty happy with the image at this stage. We have basically finished this stage of relighting, and now we can move on to our volumetrics. Let's stop this rendering, and at this point, we want to show you something really cool. We can literally put clouds in the scene. They can be between the object in the scene, as if they are just straight falling down from the sky and pouring into the valleys. They can be crammed in there somewhere just between these objects. In the previous scenario, we used volumetric material with a combination of maps, corona distance and noises. Now we are taking it a step further and will use VDB objects for the same purpose. This will be the most advanced of all the methods so far. It will offer the most possibilities, but it will also require a bit more knowledge to master and control it all. And in this scenario, we'll tell just how to import these objects into our scene and what to pay attention to. You will learn how to execute a very cool scenario. And the thing with VDBs is that they can easily go south. For example, into a rendering that lasts for tens of hours, and we may be needlessly discouraged. Don't worry though, we are able to handle these objects within reasonable time frames, so let's get at it. Let's start with just a handful of information so you know what the VDB objects are all about. Literally the bare minimum. VDB is an open volume or open voxel database object, which is a very specific object that holds various information about points in 3D space. And the fact that this data is in 3D space will be very important. Basically, if you compare it to texture, textures consist only of data in 2D. Every pixel in a texture has X and Y coordinates and a color value associated with it, while VDB objects have information stored in 3 dimensions in 3D space. For each pixel in a VDB object, which is expertly called voxel, we have much more than a piece of color information. They actually hold a lot of data about pretty much anything. This could be information such as density, temperature, color. This information mostly comes from various simulations. It might be water in Houdini, explosions in Phoenix FD, smoke or clouds or whatever. And we know how dense a given voxel is, what momentum it has, what temperature it has, motion blur, and lots of new information. The VDB objects are containers to collect all this information to render it all out properly. Now we will basically focus on clouds. We have added links in the lesson description where you can buy some of them. Some of them cost just $1. One of these rolling fogs is done by us. This scenario is so creative that you can basically use whatever you want here, whatever you can get. Once we have downloaded this object, it's time to import them into the scene. And in order to import these objects and use them in Corona, we have to go to the Objects tab, select Create New Corona Object, and click on See Volume Grid. We have a message here saying no data has loaded. So in order to load it, we have to click Load from File here and select one of our objects. In this scene, we are going to have 3 different objects. As we can see, they range from a few megabytes, depending on how accurate they are, to a few or even several gigabytes per object. So the variety here is really wide. It depends on the resolution, but also on how much information the object has. And not all of this information will be useful to us though, so bigger doesn't necessarily mean better. For us, the best is what we can simply work with. So let's upload our first cloud. We can make it smaller for now, and we will basically upload all 3 objects. So I'm going to copy that and load our second cloud. We can see it's a much smaller object, so I will scale it down. And let's upload our third object, which is this rolling fog that we simulated. So yes, we have this in the scene. We have 3 objects, and we can see that this object, since it's supposed to be a flat but wide creeping fog, it's probably rotated. And there's an option here under rendering, flip frame, that rotates this object. The fact that it's rotated by 90 degrees is a common situation. It's because different software manages axis assignment differently. And that's why we had this behavior, nothing serious. As we can see, our objects are, for the time being, simple empty boxes. So let's pick the first cloud. And the first thing we do is we want to see something here. So we need our viewport display to change from wire box to point cloud. We can basically isolate this object so that the scene doesn't interfere. We see a lot of black dots that more or less make up something that might look like a cloud. Usually we'll see something like that, which is a black or white cloud made of points. Well, the fact that it's black or white doesn't bother us at this stage, but we can generally see the shape to orientate the object in the space. We can generally see this in the viewport. Well, now, when we look at all these parameters of this VDB object, we notice that this interface itself is quite extensive. There are quite a lot of these tabs and different parameters, and as we mentioned, we don't want to break everything down here today. You could probably do a separate training just about that. Today, we simply want you to learn how to work with them at this most basic level, where you can put them into the scene and it just won't crash. We deal with what's important to us and what's essential to make the scenario work. So let's get it one step at a time. What we can say in a nutshell is that if you look more closely, you will notice a number of tabs that we already know. Here we have emission, we have absorption, we have scattering, and basically, this is exactly the same as with volumetric material. Again, absorption is sort of the density of our fog. Scattering is the color of the fog. Or, to be exact, it's what a ray of light acquires as it moves through this fog or cloud in this case. The operating principle is the same, but the names themselves might be slightly different. Let's discuss them just briefly so you know what you are dealing with. We can see the absorption tab. We can see that we have something called a channel. And at this point, this channel is set to density. If we set constant here, then generally every voxel in the box will look identical. It will be very similar to when we use volumetric material without any additional maps, a uniform density for the large volumetric box. If we change this from constant to density, then we have this non-uniform density, similar to what we did with the noise maps in the previous lesson. The main difference though is that it is not a noise map anymore, but a real cloud shape. We got all the information about its density at any 3D coordinate. For example, there is 100% density there, and at the edge, where it is thinner, this density might be lower. Density generally introduces all this spatiality of the cloud, so we definitely care about it, and sometimes instead of density, it might be just called something else. For example, in this object, we have something like smoke phx. It depends on the program where it was created, so sometimes you have to search and guess. But generally we look for a name just related to smoke, density, or something like that. Sometimes you just have to click through the different options. In addition to the channel, we also have a tint, but it shouldn't interest us for the time being. But what will be very important is the scale. And scale does exactly what distance value does in corona volumetric material. Namely, it controls the density. The smaller the value, the sparser the object is. And the larger the value, the denser the object is. And this is something that is generally hard to set explicitly because these are completely dimensionless values. Previously we had centimeters that we would somehow compare with our scene, and now they just have a value of 1 by default, that we can decrease, increase. We can see that the nature of what it looks like in the viewport changes here, but actually these values can be very different depending on the object where it was created and what we expect from it. So for one cloud, for example, we can expect a scale of 0.01, and for another we can expect a scale of 10. So that's unfortunately something that we need to test in render, in interactive, to just get an idea of how it behaves. For now we can go back to 1 and move on to the scattering values. As for the scattering tab, sometimes we have to turn it on. If we change the channel, we can see the character of this cloud changes to gray. We also have constant, exactly as a second ago. However, if we use density here, it might lead us to a weird result. It will use the density to apply to the scattering color, meaning the highest density will become white and the low density will become black. And the reason that's bad is that the cloud, the water vapor itself, it's uniform for the whole. It doesn't change color depending on where the cloud is, so we usually use the constant value. However, if you wanted to, well, you have that option. And adding a noise map here, for example, adds the impression of volumetric detail, especially for such turbulent phenomena as some explosions. However, we will stay with a completely basic setting, which means we are leaning towards this constant setting. There's a neat little trick here though, that we can gain from setting up the density for a brief moment. We don't want to use this channel when rendering. Instead, we can use it in the viewport to see how our general point cloud behaves. It may not be kind of 100% realistic, but it is able to help us evaluate such an object in the viewport. We can still increase the quality when it comes to the viewport display. Make it 1. We can see that with constant, we end up with a gray cloud-like shape, and with the density, we have something that reminds us of a cloud in 3D. We can take advantage of the way this point cloud is shaded so that we are able to understand better what's going on here and what it looks like spatially. Sometimes we can adjust that scaling of scattering to have as much of that shading as possible, which is from black to white. Sometimes at this scale, which is our default, it doesn't show it the best. But you can see it pretty well here, so it's a useful trick. And it is often a good idea to set the objects in the scene using the default scale of 1, and use this scattering after we set the density. Then, in the viewport itself, you can see what's going on. When we start tweaking it, we will most likely reduce this scale to some very small values, so we'll be left with a couple of dots only here. Okay, as far as scattering goes, we have directionality here, which works identically to what we had in corona volume material. With clouds, larger values are attractive. They create this kind of silver lining effect, highlighting this cloud silhouette, and that's usually what we are looking for. So this will definitely be worth considering. Well, we have a single bounce only option here as well. It was turned off by default in our Corona volume material, and here in the VDB objects, it is turned on by default. This is obviously a question of optimization. We'll keep this option on for now, and we'll come back to it later. And then we also have our step size, the same thing that was in the last lesson. Again, this is typically a rendering optimization, but we will come back to that as well to test it in action. That would be it in terms of discussing this VDB object. There are a few things we couldn't discuss here, but we think that the ones we have mentioned are the key to setting up this scenario, and honestly, many more. The rest is kind of the icing on the cake, which you can explore on your own. So that would be that, short and sweet. I will reset all these parameters to the initial ones. Basically, we didn't change anything. If we had something change, you can always right-click on the arrows and it returns to the default setting, if we didn't remember what the default was. Okay, so for the other objects, we can also turn on some kind of point cloud view here. Scattering, density, and here we have this rolling fog of ours. We do the same thing. Point cloud, quality, scattering. And we see that with this object we have just a few of these points. So to see anything at all in the viewport, we would have to change the absorption scale. We see 10, 100, and we are able to see this object now. It won't necessarily look good in the render with this setting, but now at least we know what's going on. We can also increase the scattering scale, and then we start to understand where something is denser here and where something is sparser. And I will say it again, these can be values that are completely wrong in rendering. We are not guided by the fact that it looks good in the viewport. Whereas for the time being, we want to set it at this level, we just want to be able to, see anything. Well then, let's explore our entire scene. First, let's get into the setting of these two clouds and isolate what we need most. I will select the mountains in the background, all this terrain, perhaps this water somewhere. This spring. Maybe a terrace to outline where the building is. We want to have as few of these objects as possible because we will need the freedom in the interactive mode. We don't want to overload this machine by rendering some unnecessary scatterers or details that don't interest us much at the moment. Okay, well, and now we can move on to placing these clouds somewhere here in our scene. And now that we have hidden these objects, let's turn on interactive. Let's place these clouds more or less where we want them. I want this cloud to be somewhere in the valley. Of course, I will have to make it bigger. We can also turn off this global fog, because basically it's just going to bother us for the moment. And we can see that at this point, what's happening with this cloud is that it's just a very dense, very black blob. So certainly the fact that we have that scale here doesn't help our rendering. I will switch it to constant. And we can see that it is already lightened up a little bit. So the density was darkening this cloud. We can already see that there's something going on here, but it's a very dense volumetric. It almost looks like some kind of liquid, some kind of milk, so we definitely don't want that much of a scale. We'll try to lower it down. And also, we forgot to change this directionality. It will definitely help us a little bit. I think we can try to reduce this scale by 10 and see what happens. We can see that this cloud perception has changed completely. It's gone from such a very, very heavily detailed to basically such a very blurry light fog. We can still, for example, try to increase the scale here of the scattering, and this object should become brighter. We can see that, indeed, this cloud appears definitely brighter. And now it's just a matter of fitting it into our environment. I would like to insert it here into this boundary between the scene layers. Okay, this is more or less what I expect from this cloud. Lying in the valley, pretty soft. We don't have the impression of such a surface where the detail is missing. We have absorption scale of 0.01, scattering scale of 2 and directionality at 0.6. We have single bounce turned on. This is the default value. As the name suggests, turning this setting on makes only a single bounce of light within the whole object. And turning it off can dramatically change our perception of a VDB object. If we were to turn it off, we would notice that the brightness should change a bit. It may not be so noticeable on interactive, but it's definitely something you notice in production, especially if the cloud is dense, similar to what we had in the beginning. Then having a single bounce only off can turn out to be quite useful, but it will definitely slow down the rendering significantly. When we turn it off, it counts as many bounces as is given globally for our scene in render settings. Usually it will be 25, and suddenly the rendering time skyrockets. If we want to render a dense VDB object during the day, this single bounce often must be turned off to get any kind of credibility and realism, and it has to be handled somewhat differently. Nevertheless, this is a topic for another lesson. We are building this scene under blue hour conditions, and this fact is simply a convenience we decided on purpose to sell something that works as a single bounce only. Achieving reliable results under such moody conditions is much simpler, and we think you should start your VDB adventure with something like this, just so you don't get discouraged. If we had a strong directional daylight in the scene here, this scenario would have to be approached a little differently. We would spend a lot of time on testing and even more on rendering itself. Okay, going back to our scenario. We want the impression of a cloud that is settling softly in a valley, somewhere here. So we don't need such a very hard, turbulent smoke structure. We are actually looking for that softness, and we get it within this single bounce only option. So it even works in our favor. In terms of optimization, we can still play with this step size. At this point, I was moving this cloud and this scene was not very responsive. And well, it was my small mistake because I set the step size to 1 centimeter, which is a complete overkill with a cloud that is several tens of meters here, if not more. And we can increase this value. In fact, we can look for step size analogously to the previous lesson. I believe that with 100 centimeters absolutely no detail will be lost, and the scene will be just much more responsive to what is happening. So basically, with these clouds we should do it right away, and I will do it right away for the other clouds we are about to place here, because why bother? As for this second cloud, we should place it in our scene as well. And we need to make it bigger. We can see that we just have it pitch black, so let's fix it step by step. We reduce the scattering to constant. We are already starting to see some detail, and it's very good. Let's also change directionality to 0.6 to be consistent. Let's try to increase this scattering, that is, let's lighten the cloud. And it is already starting to look better. I am not changing the scale for now. Instead, I am going to enlarge it and move it somewhere here. Now, we are trying to copy and arrange it. Maybe I will freeze it so it doesn't get selected by accident. I can even go up to 200 with this step size without a problem. For now, it's just such a wild guessing game, but it's a small enough value at this scale that I don't think we lose anything. I will copy the object and I will rotate it a little bit. Move it around. Maybe I will try to reduce this absorption a little bit for this object. And now, we mostly build the composition in the context of our background. I'm looking at how it combines with the lines of the mountains. For now, we are doing it so tentatively because we are still going to get the building, so it will probably change a bit. But the effect is that we have this soft, not so expressive cloud somewhere here, more in the valley, and it builds the bottom of this. Now, in order to build this top edge, we use this second cloud. It's more expressive and at the same time, everything is soft enough that somehow it blends together fairly coherently. As we can see, raising the step size to 200 has significantly improved the quality of the work in interactive. Now, some artifacts may appear sometimes, for example, at the intersection of these objects in the interactive, but they will quickly be recalculated and cleaned. The main thing is not to overdo the step size. If we have hard time working in interactive, we can raise it even higher. We probably won't lose anything. And even if we were to lose a little bit of detail here at interactive, well, we can get back to a better value later. The main thing is to be able to work here. Otherwise, we won't be able to set it up in any meaningful way. Later on, we might still move this around as we add the building in view here. We can also use a brush later in post-production to change anything we want. So we have a lot of options here. So far, the softness looks convincing to me, and at this point, we are still missing that rolling fog in the foreground. That's why I'm going to isolate different elements from the scene. We'll take that rolling fog here, and maybe we'll add a few more elements to this isolation, so that it's easier to understand what we are looking at, in general. Some kind of structural element here. As long as we don't have any scatterers isolated, I think everything is okay. These stones are unlikely to crash 3ds Max. Okay, so we have isolated it. Well, for now, we can start setting it up in the viewport. We can see something here. Something is happening. We are going to try to turn it sideways, parallel to the camera. And it is probably too big here. We want it to cover the foreground here and not necessarily pour into the whole scene. So I think something like this will be adequate. We can reset these values again. As for the step size, this object is probably too close to give it 200 centimeters here. But I think 50 should be okay, at least for this initial look. This directionality we can set at 0.6 and let's see in interactive how it looks and adjust the rest of the stuff. For now, I don't think we see anything. And in general, the mountains in the background disappeared because they were frozen. So I would take them back because they were relevant. So, like I said, we can't see anything. By that we mean that the absorption scale is just too small. Let's try to increase it so we can start to see something here. We can correct this blackness by scattering scale. We'll change this scattering to a constant from smoke. And immediately we can see that we actually have some sort of creeping fog that we are interested in. We can increase this scale even more to make it denser. Perhaps add more scattering to make it also brighter. And we are slowly getting into a value that doesn't change too much. So maybe let's thicken it more. I think something like this should be okay. Let's see if this step size somehow significantly changes it. And we can see that the fog is much denser now. At 50 we didn't have that. Which doesn't mean it was worse. Sometimes we might like this fog just to be a bit more natural looking, and in this case, I think it is. Okay, maybe let's set it at 10. Let's see, for example, if the 5 give us something that we don't have here. And in fact, here there isn't such a big difference between 5 and 10. So maybe let's stay at 10. We already have a kind of thick smoke. Now, what remains is the question of fitting it into our view, so that this fits into the foreground compositionally. We can raise this vapor a bit. And we can probably, for example, copy this object and fill in those parts of the scene. Where the first fog was not enough, that is here, for example. So we can copy this object, enlarge it, and fill in this meadow in front of the building with it. We can now see that we are in a sea of clouds, which starts there, basically from the background, from those clouds that we set up at the beginning. It permeates through the whole scene and ends basically at the camera. Perhaps I will lower it maybe a little bit. We can still unhide all the lights we have hidden so far to see how it looks in this context. Perhaps what is illuminating this building is too bright, which we can solve in two ways. Either modify the lights or move our cloud here. Here, for example, it is too high and interacts too much. There is not much room for maneuver here. So we'll probably have to modify the light to weaken it. This is the one that affects only the reflection, and this is the stronger one that affects the rest. At this point, we have already weakened it a little bit. We could pick it up and try to modify it. We'll see how it behaves when we turn it. If that's not working, we can always increase the step size. It should become softer. Also, we can change this scale so that this fog in this place is not so dense. This should also help us a little. We can also make it a little darker by decreasing this scattering scale. The same thing we can basically do in this object here. We don't need it to be so heavily detailed. On the other hand, I would enlarge it a little bit so that it takes up the whole part of the scene here. And I can already see that something more interesting is happening. Nevertheless, I think it's still a bit too bright here, so I will refer to those lights again. Let's see what it looks like when I turn it off completely. And I must say, it's not that bad. Maybe I will just add the object here to exclude. And that will basically help me solve the problem without modifying this light's direction too much. It should be much better. Here is another light, the one we have as visible in reflections. I can move it around a bit so that we can see what it illuminates in general, and it still illuminates this cloud. It's pretty sad without it, so I think we'll keep it. And that would be basically it. It works well together. Maybe that bit here in the foreground is a bit too flashy. I would move it a little bit to the camera. I would lower it also a little bit. I will yet try to run the interactive mode with everything we put in the scene. I should be able to do it because we have these VDB objects quite optimized with this bigger step size. We'll see how it looks with all the stones, which will probably cast some shadows. I think it could be quite nice. And if it looks satisfying, I think we'll start the production render. We still need to turn on the global volumetric because we don't have it now. And those mountains in the background get lost. In addition, this global volumetrics should tone the whole thing down a bit. I like how those stones look in this fog. It certainly plays cool. Now, based on this view, we can still adjust what we see in the foreground. First of all, this object should be moved somehow. Maybe I will lift it up a little. For example, I don't want this bush to be visible here. You have to wait a bit for it to catch all these details, so we can't rush it. Maybe I will increase it a little bit. A little bit more. As for those clouds in the background, I would move them a little bit more too. That cloud just happens to come to the end of the chimney, which is not very fortunate. I will lower it. I think you can add a little bit of scale to them to make the detail pop out a little bit more. Okay, I think it definitely looks better now. What I'm not sure about is whether this character stands out enough in the foreground. Maybe it does. There are some highlights here. It's not the worst. I will render a mask for this character and decide later. I will make myself a rendering element and then in post-production will probably still refer to it. Maybe I will scale down this fog in the foreground just in one axis, the z-axis, so that these height differences of the hills and valleys in this rolling fog are a bit bigger. I think that it gives it a bit of punch with the side light. The shadows will be a bit bigger here, and it will be interesting to see how it looks with a different step size. We've been tinkering with it a bit for quite some time, but I feel that now this composition of these lines, in this case, that's building up from all this, it's pretty much the most interesting. Small tweaks make a difference in terms of the composition and geometric core. You can play with this endlessly. The important thing is to have it optimized enough to be able to play with it at all. Of course, we can't evaluate everything in the interactive, but it's just enough. Well, let's render it out and approach post-production. We'll see where we land after the rendering is done. We'll try to tweak a few things that we weren't able to catch. Anyway, what annoys me in this scene here are these two bushes that I can't somehow cover with this fog. So I will stop wrestling with it and just hide those objects. I feel that the composition will be more interesting, in the sense that we won't have this obstacle here, which all the time didn't allow me to position it the way I wanted. So I kind of brute force the problem, which is fine by me. So, as I said, we are going to set our mask on this guy of ours. We have him in the red channel. Other than that, other masks we don't particularly need. We'll take the material ID and wire color. And we'll take the volumetrics too, so that we have some extra volumetrics alone in the scene. And basically, one last thing to do in 3ds Max is turning on our production assets and rendering this image. Okay, so we have our finished render and a couple of masks. The volumetric itself, the mask with our character, material ID, and wire color. Not sure if we are going to use that though. I brought this tree mask I've had from previous lesson as well. Let's see what we can do here. The first thing I wanted to do is to inspect the few too bright elements. Let's start with this tree. I will use this mask, going into the channels, the green channel, and I've got the selection. And I'm going to add a curve here straight away. I am mainly concerned with the brighter parts. They were a bit too bright. So here I need to mask it out so that it only applies to the tree. Perhaps the stone too, because it competes with the fog here. I would like it to be a little darker. We have a few artifacts from this fog, but it's an easy fix. As for these channels, something like this should be enough. Another mask, and we go a bit lower with this stone. And it's already better. The last thing I wanted to bring down is the reflection in the glass, both in this one, and this element here. It is kind of in conflict with this character here. We want him to come forward, so we are going to lower that. I'm just going to mark this glass here. And I can actually do it in a number of ways. We'll try to do a curve adjustment. We are going to give a blending mode here so that we keep the darker areas. Maybe I will take this selection again and I will put a little bit of this color in to make it more uniform. Earlier, there was something off with this saturation. Now I have the impression that it is better and this character really pops. As for the character itself, I will use this mask. I would definitely like to add an extra layer of curve adjustment here to boost it. And at the same time, I would add hue saturation here and turn it a bit orange and increase saturation at the same time. Maybe not necessarily on the legs themselves. I can lower this part, but we want to make the code to be more vivid. I think those elements are improved. Now we can look at our fog and see what we can tweak there. The fragment of the meadow has come out from under this fog, so I might try to cover it up a bit somehow. As for this background, I think the fog is unnecessarily here. So basically I can immediately use the clone tool. As for the rest of it, you could brush it out and make it a bit more subtle. At the moment, I feel that compositionally there's a bit too much going on here, so I will make myself a new layer. Here in the brushes, I've got our fog brush that we used literally 2 lessons back, and I'm going to sample that. I am going to move it higher up. I feel like it's working a bit better already. Maybe you're still here. Now we need to add some noise after the whole thing. I'm thinking 2% and then it will merge the whole thing better. So we've got that sorted out. Now, a couple of issues of this mid-ground. We can get some more of that smoke in here. I will mask it out with these stones later. I'm looking for quite a soft transition here. I think it will help, because we don't really want the smoke to end up as thick as it is right now. Maybe it would be better to soften it a little more. We add noise again. And here we can focus on the stones so that it doesn't catch something like that here. We can invert the selection to have a different mask. We can possibly subtract a little more if we have too much. But my impression is that it's reasonably okay. Well, maybe a little bit here. Now, this transition is slicker. Okay, now would just like to look at the colors some more. Maybe I would add some warmth here with such a big, soft brush. Somewhere around this area. Let's set soft light to weaken that kind of blue accent here a little bit. To add a sense of luminosity to this area. And now we can take on the colors. We want the contrast between blue and orange or yellow to be very strong. At the moment it is already there, but on a very naturalistic level in terms of colors. We want to go push it a little bit further. I think the easiest way to do that is through color balance. And we want to pour these colors in, basically from the shadows. We'll treat the shadows the strongest. We want to pour a lot of blue in here, a lot of cyan. We can see that already with the cyan, they kind of make a fundamental difference in terms of this feeling. Now with these midtones, we'll do something similar, I think, only on a smaller scale. In the highlights, on the other hand, a little bit of cyan, but more yellow. We can see that it's getting there, and now we just need to work on the warm colors. Bend them up a bit, add saturation. I think we are going to do that through hue saturation adjustment. We'll select that area somewhere and turn the whole thing into this kind of orange. We can possibly lower it. Still working on the range a little bit, increase it a little bit. And as we can see, it's already better in terms of color readability. We could try, for example, still copying this layer. In addition, this will still add some independent control. As far as the colors are concerned, we still have some of these greens here. So by selective color, we'll take off the yellows and maybe add some magenta. We'll get into that kind of desaturated cyan side. I think the colors are more or less the way we would like them to be. And there's still the matter of adjusting the curve eventually, adding a bit of that styling. We'll try to lower it here as a whole. At the same time, these shadows are raised a little bit. We rise these shadows. The range decreases and the whole image becomes even moodier. By the way, with a lower tonal range, this contrast decreases, and I think that's the look we're looking for here. One that is very moody and quite dark, utilizing these mists on different levels, from the far background to the very foreground. We don't really need to do any vignettes here anymore because it has become a bit natural with all these modifications. And we can consider this image as finished. You can pat yourself on the back. Well done! It's been a crazy journey. This is a very last lesson and it was quite a long one, right? But there were a lot of such a production tricks in it, so we hope you enjoyed it, this scenario, as well as our entire training and generally the school of thought. We hope you get inspired and show us some epic scenarios soon.
So what can I say? Again, we would love to thank you for this long journey. We hope you understand the DNA of the lighting process and how to use it to your advantage. And as Bartosz said, we cannot wait to see your work on social media. We wish you all the best in your career and see you sometime in the future. Bye.